Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Mark here. It's been raining in my city for 3 days straight now, and the weather has finally started to cool down. A few days ago it was unbearably hot. So at first, the rain actually felt pretty nice. But after several days of nonstop rain, it starts to get a little depressing. My dog, though, has been loving it. No matter what the weather is like, he gets excited every single time we go for a walk. He runs around like the happiest creature on earth. He's such an energetic and joyful dog. Honestly, I don't know how I'd live my life without him. Whenever I pet him, my mood instantly calms down. He has such a good personality. As long as you feed him well, he's completely satisfied, and nothing else in the world can bother him. Honestly, I admire that mindset. I'm not exactly sure what breed he is, maybe a Beagle and Shiba mix. His back fur is completely black, and his chest is white with little black spots. But the funniest part is his beard. His left side is black, and his right side is white. It looks like he intentionally styled it that way. He's also an amazing eater. That's probably his only flaw. Oh, by the way, my dog's name is Black. Anyway, I haven't updated this channel much lately, mainly because not many people have been watching. The recent monster episodes and magical realism stories I posted didn't really get much traffic. So honestly, I started losing motivation. At one point, I even thought about giving up and starting a completely new channel about how to make money with AI. But that whole process is complicated. And since I still have a full-time job, I just don't have that much time. So here I am, back on this channel, trying something new today. And today's story, it's all about drama. Today, we're breaking down a dark, slow-burn tragedy straight out of a rainy Massachusetts town. We'll dive into the story of Daniel, a detective returning home, only to find himself trapped in a dangerous and forbidden relationship with his brother's deeply unhappy wife, Hannah. Add in a toxic local billionaire, a chillingly manipulative neighbor, pulling everyone's strings like a puppet master, and a devastating betrayal. And everything spirals completely out of control. It's a messy and haunting story about guilt, revenge, and the silent secrets that can quietly destroy an entire family. So grab a drink, get comfortable, and let's get into it.
The October fog did not rise from the ground. It seemed to press down from the grey Massachusetts sky, swallowing the tops of the skeletal maples and blurring the sharp gables of Willow Street. Daniel Mercer kept his hands tight on the steering wheel of his weathered sedan, his eyes tracing the familiar, cracked asphalt of his childhood neighborhood. After 5 years in the Marines and a brief, bruising stint with the state police department out west, the town felt smaller, denser, and thick with an old, stagnant dampness. He slowed down as he passed number 44. The house was abandoned now, its porch sagging like a broken jaw, weeds choking the driveway where he and his older brother, Michael, used to toss a deflated basketball. A sudden, sharp prickle of guilt tightened in Daniel's chest. He had left this town to escape the suffocating weight of family expectations, leaving Michael behind to carry it all. Now, returning as a newly hired local detective, the badge in his pocket felt less like an achievement and more like a penance. He pulled up to the curb of a well-maintained Victorian duplex 3 blocks down. The contrast was stark. The porch light was a warm, welcoming amber, and the scent of yeast and caramelized sugar drifted from the backyard, where Michael's detached baking kitchen stood. Before Daniel could even turn off the ignition, the front door flew open. Michael stepped out, wearing a flour-dusted apron over a faded flannel shirt. He was 38, but his shoulders were rounded, his hairline retreating, and a perpetual, anxious kindness creased the corners of his eyes. He looked physically unimpressive, a man who had spent his life softening dough rather than hardening his edges. "Daniel," Michael shouted, his voice cracking with genuine joy. He jogged down the steps, engulfing his younger brother in a bear hug that smelled intensely of cinnamon and wood smoke. "Look at you. You're a house. Let me look at you." "Good to see you, Mike," Daniel said, a rare, genuine smile breaking through his disciplined facade. As they hauled Daniel's duffel bags up the porch steps, Michael slapped his back. "I still can't believe you are back for good. The department is lucky to have you. And look, you're staying here." "No arguments. The upstairs apartment is completely furnished." His voice dropping into a conspiratorial, warm tone. "With my hours at the bakery, it'll be good to have another man in the house." The phrase hung in the damp air. Daniel nodded, though an inexplicable chill rippled across his shoulders. They stepped into the narrow entryway, and the warmth of the house wrapped around them. That was when Daniel saw her. Hannah stood at the foot of the stairs, holding a wicker basket full of crisp, white linens. She was 28, but possessed an elegant, fragile beauty that seemed out of place in the cramped, domestic hallway. Her dark hair was pinned up loosely, a few stray tendrils framing a pale, striking face. Her eyes, a sharp, liquid hazel, locked onto Daniel's. "Hannah, this is Daniel," Michael said proudly, rushing to her side. "Daniel, my wife." "Welcome home, Daniel," she said. Her voice was low, carrying a faint, melodic cadence, the lingering echo of a classical piano teacher who spent too much time in her own head. "Thank you, Hannah. It is a pleasure," Daniel replied, stepping forward to take the basket from her hands. As he lifted the wicker handles, his fingers brushed against hers. It was a brief accidental contact, but Hannah did not pull away immediately. Her skin was unusually cold. For a fraction of a second, her gaze lingered on his face, scanning the hard line of his jaw and the quiet intensity of his eyes with a hunger so raw it startled him. She looked away just a beat too slowly, a faint flush creeping up her neck. I'll go fix some tea," she murmured, turning toward the kitchen. Daniel watched her go, noticing how the fading afternoon sunlight caught the fraying edges of her cardigan. She moved with a deliberate grace, but there was an invisible tension in her posture, like a spring wound too tight. The social pecking order of the town was fully on display 3 nights later at the Grace Episcopal Church autumn fundraiser. The gymnasium was decorated with plastic pumpkins and dried cornstalks, the air smelling of apple cider and damp wool coats. Daniel stood near the back wall, his posture instinctively rigid, a glass of punch melting in his hand. He watched Michael across the room, happily talking to an elderly customer about the price of rye flour. Michael was entirely in his element here, humble, transparent, and completely blind to the subtle shifts in the room's atmosphere. Then, the heavy double doors opened, and the room's energy pivoted. Ethan Cole entered, at 42. Ethan was the town's golden boy, a real estate developer whose name adorned half the commercial strip malls outside Boston, and a major donor to the local police union. He was charming, physically fit, and wore a tailored charcoal overcoat that made everyone else look like they were wearing rags. Ethan smiled, a dazzling, practiced flash of white teeth, and clapped the man on the shoulder. He began moving through the crowd like a politician, distributing compliments and easy laughter. But as Daniel watched from the shadows, he noticed Ethan's eyes. They were restless, sharp, and entirely detached from the warmth of his smile. Ethan didn't look at people to connect with them. He looked at them the way a collector evaluates a gallery. Ethan's gaze swept across the gymnasium and stopped dead on Hannah. She was standing by the raffle table, wearing a dark green velvet dress that she had clearly saved for an occasion like this. She looked beautiful, but isolated, standardly ignored by the older suburban matrons. Ethan adjusted his cuffs and began making a direct line toward her. Daniel felt a sudden protective instinct flare up. He moved through the crowd, stepping into Ethan's path just as the developer reached the table. "Mr. Cole," Daniel said, his voice a calm, professional baritone. "I'm Daniel Mercer, the new detective down at the precinct." Ethan paused, his smile shifting seamlessly to accommodate the interruption. He offered a firm, dry hand. "Ah, the returning hero. Michael's little brother. Welcome back, Detective. We're glad to have a man of your caliber keeping our streets safe." Ethan's eyes flicked over Daniel's shoulder, anchoring back onto Hannah, who had turned around at the sound of their voices. "And you must be Hannah," Ethan said, bypassing Daniel entirely with a smooth, predatory grace. He took her hand, bowing his head slightly. "Michael is a lucky man. His bakery makes the best sourdough in the county, but clearly he's been keeping his finest treasure hidden away." It was a line so smooth it should have been repulsive, but Daniel saw the immediate effect it had on Hannah. Her chest rose sharply, her eyes widened, reflecting the bright gymnasium lights. For years, she had been a ghost in her own life. Suddenly, a powerful, wealthy man was looking at her as if she were the only person in the room. "Thank you, Mr. Cole," she whispered, a genuine smile breaking across her face. "Call me Ethan, please," he said, his voice dropping into an intimate register. His gaze lingered on her lips, a fraction of a second too long, before he turned back to Daniel with an enigmatic grin. "We're all family in this town, Detective. I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot of each other." Daniel didn't answer. His blood ran cold. He recognized that look. It was the look of a man who saw something he wanted, and who had never been told no in his entire life. Late that night, long after the house had grown dark, and the autumn wind began to howl through the eaves of Willow Street, Daniel lay awake in his upstairs apartment. The ambient silence of the suburbs was louder than he remembered, filled with the creaks of old timber. Suddenly, a faint, melancholic sound drifted up through the floorboards. It was the piano. Hannah was playing. The melody was classical, intricate, and deeply sorrowful. Daniel sat up, listening. The music swelled, filling the dark apartment with a palpable, aching loneliness. It felt like a confession, a private window into a soul that was suffocating under the weight of an unfulfilling existence. Then, right at the precipice of a major chord, the music stopped. It didn't resolve. It simply cut off, leaving a ringing, agonizing silence in the dark. Daniel stared at the ceiling. He realized, with a sudden, terrifying clarity, that Hannah was profoundly unhappy. And worse, he realized that he was drawn to that unhappiness. A dangerous, forbidden gravity was pulling him toward his brother's wife. "I should find my own place," he thought, turning over and staring at the wall. "I should leave." But he didn't. By November, the rain had set in. It was a cold, relentless New England deluge that turned the fallen leaves into a slick, rotting carpet on the sidewalks and made the Victorian duplex feel claustrophobically small. Because Michael woke up at 2 in the morning every day to open the bakery, the daytime hours belonged to Daniel and Hannah. The shared domesticity became a minefield of unspoken tension. They fell into a quiet, rhythmic proximity. There were shared pots of black coffee in the morning, brief conversations about the weather, and small, accidental intimacies that left the air thick with static. One rainy Tuesday, Daniel was rushing to get to the station for an early shift. He was fumbling with his tie in the hallway, his fingers clumsy from a lack of sleep. "Let me," a voice murmured. Hannah stepped out of the kitchen. She was wearing a soft, oversized cream sweater, her hair pinned up with a silver clip. She stepped directly into his space. Daniel froze, his breath catching in his throat. She reached up, her cool fingers brushing against his neck as she took the silk fabric of the tie. She worked with practiced efficiency, her eyes focused intently on the knot. She was so close he could smell her, a delicate mix of vanilla, lavender soap, and the faint, earthy scent of rain. "Michael never wears ties," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "He says they make him feel like he is choking." "It is part of the uniform," Daniel replied, his voice rough. She finished the knot, but she didn't step back. Her hands rested lightly against his chest, right over his beating heart. She looked up, her hazel eyes swimming with an unspoken, desperate plea. "See me," her eyes said. "Save me." "Daniel." The grandfather clock in the living room chimed, breaking the spell. Daniel caught her wrists, gently but firmly removing her hands from his chest. "I have to go, Hannah," he said, his voice tight with an enforced formality. Her face fell, a mask of deep humiliation washing over her features. She stepped back, nodding quickly, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. This rejection didn't douse the fire, it only intensified her desire, twisting it into a desperate need to break through his armor. While Daniel retreated behind his professional walls, Ethan Cole moved closer. Ethan began appearing at Michael's bakery almost daily. He would buy boxes of pastries he clearly didn't eat, lingering by the counter, chatting amiably with Michael while his eyes tracked Hannah through the bead curtain that separated the shop from their living quarters. Vivian Hart, the next-door neighbor, noticed everything. Vivian was a 63-year-old retired therapist who lived alone in the matching half of the duplex. To the neighborhood, she was a warm, motherly figure who spent her days knitting on her porch and offering freshly baked cookies. In reality, Vivian was the apex predator of human psychology. Bored by retirement, she viewed the people around her as chess pieces, engineering small dramas just to watch the fallout. She didn't cause chaos directly. She merely unlocked the doors. People were too afraid to open themselves. On a Friday afternoon, Vivian spotted Hannah sitting on the porch, staring blankly at the rain. Vivian walked over, holding 2 mugs of hot tea. "You look like a woman lost at sea, dear," Vivian said smoothly, taking a seat in the wicker chair next to her. Hannah forced a polite smile. "Just thinking, Vivian, the weather gets to me sometimes." Vivian took a slow sip of her tea, her sharp eyes mapping the dark circles under Hannah's eyes. "It's not the weather, it's the house. It's too quiet for someone with your fire. I saw Ethan Cole stopping by the bakery again today. He certainly seems attentive." Hannah's cheeks flushed. "He's just being a supportive patron of Michael's business." Vivian laughed, a soft, dry sound. "Oh, darling, men like Ethan Cole don't care about sourdough. He looks at you the way a starving man looks at a feast. And frankly, who can blame him? Michael is a sweet soul, but he's simple. He belongs to the flour and the yeast. You belong in a world with color." Hannah looked down at her hands, her heart hammering against her ribs. Vivian's words were a sweet, intoxicating poison. "Sometimes," Vivian whispered, leaning in closer, "life sends the right man too late. The tragedy isn't making a mistake, Hannah. The tragedy is staying inside a mistake until you die." The breaking point arrived in late November at the annual neighborhood block party, held inside a heated community barn to escape the biting cold. Alcohol flowed freely, a roaring bonfire crackled outside, and a local folk band played a lively rhythmic tune. Daniel stood by the drinks table, watching the room. Michael was sitting with a group of older men, completely engrossed in a discussion about municipal zoning laws. Hannah stood a few feet away from her husband, entirely ignored, her fingers gripping a plastic cup of wine. The band shifted into a slow, haunting waltz. Ethan Cole materialized from the crowd, stepping directly up to Hannah. He offered his hand. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Mercer?" Hannah flicked a glance toward Michael, who didn't even look up. Resentment, sharp and hot, flared in her chest. She looked at Ethan, then her eyes drifted to Daniel, who was watching her from across the room with a look of intense, agonizing restraint. She bypassed Ethan's hand, walked directly across the room, and stopped in front of Daniel. "Dance with me," she said. It wasn't a request. Daniel looked at her. He knew he should say no. Every instinct, every shred of his rigid marine discipline and moral upbringing screamed at him to walk away. But looking at her flushed and defiant, his resolve crumbled. "One dance," he said tightly. He took her hand and led her to the edge of the crowded dance floor. The moment his arm wrapped around her waist, a shudder ran through them both. They moved together with a fluid, terrifying synchronization. Hannah pulled herself closer than social convention allowed, her head resting just beneath his chin. "I can't breathe in that house, Daniel," she whispered into his shirt. "Please, tell me you feel it too." Daniel didn't answer with words. His grip on her waist tightened, pulling her flush against his body. For a single, suspended moment, as the music swelled around them, they were completely alone. He looked down, his eyes locking onto her mouth. Their lips were inches apart. The air between them was combustible. It was an almost kiss, a silent surrender to a shared damnation. Then Daniel pulled his head back. He looked past her shoulder. Michael was standing by the edge of the dance floor. He was holding 2 plates of food, his face entirely pale, his eyes wide and hollow. He had seen everything. He had seen the way his brother held his wife, and the way his wife looked at his brother. Michael didn't yell. He didn't drop the plates. He simply turned around and walked out of the barn into the freezing night. It was the most dangerous silence Daniel had ever encountered. In the days that followed, the duplex became a tomb. Michael completely withdrew into himself. He stopped talking, stopped smiling, and began spending 18 hours a day at the bakery. He didn't confront Hannah, and he didn't confront Daniel. His silent, crushing grief was a heavy, suffocating fog that filled every room. Daniel, consumed by a paralyzing guilt, stopped staying at the house during the day, throwing himself into his police work to avoid his brother's ghost, like presence. Hannah felt entirely abandoned again. Michael's silence felt less like forgiveness and more like a passive, destructive punishment. Her loneliness curdled into an angry, desperate spite. Ethan Cole, sensing the fracture in the house, moved in for the kill. He intercepted Hannah as she was walking home from the grocery store one grey afternoon. He pulled his luxury SUV to the curb, rolling down the window. "It's freezing, Hannah. Let me give you a ride." Hannah hesitated, the cold wind biting through her thin coat. She looked at the warm leather interior of the car. She thought of Michael's silence and Daniel's cowardly retreat. She got in. Ethan didn't take her home. He drove to a quiet, secluded overlook above the river. He didn't pressure her. Instead, he offered an expertly crafted symphony of comfort and validation. "You don't belong in that cold house, Hannah," Ethan said, his voice smooth as silk as he reached over and took her gloved hand. "You are a magnificent creature. You deserve a man who can give you the world, not a man who smells like flour and hides in the dark." Hannah wept. She didn't love Ethan, she knew. Deep down, he was a predator. But she was a starving person, and Ethan was offering a feast of attention. She resisted, but her defenses were crumbling like dry leaves. The final shove came from Vivian. The next morning, Vivian invited Hannah over for tea. The older woman sat across from her, carefully pouring chamomile into delicate porcelain cups. "Michael knows," Hannah whispered, her hands shaking so badly the tea sloshed over the rim. "And Daniel won't look at me. I've ruined everything, Vivian." Vivian set the teapot down with a soft, deliberate click. She leaned across the table, her eyes completely devoid of the warmth she usually faked for the neighborhood. "Listen to me, Hannah," Vivian said, her voice hard and commanding. "Men are inherently cowardly creatures. They hide behind duty, behind guilt, behind silence. They don't make choices. They wait for the world to choose for them. Women must be the architects of their own fate. Daniel loves you, but he will never break his brother's heart on his own. You must force his hand." Hannah looked up, her tears drying. "How?" "You must make him realize what he's losing," Vivian whispered, an unsettling sharp smile touching her lips. "Give him a reason to fight, or give yourself a reason to forget him." This became Hannah's turning point. The poison had fully entered her bloodstream. She decided, with a cold, desperate resolve, Daniel must either love her or he must lose her entirely. The storm hit on the first week of December, a vicious, early winter gale that brought freezing rain and howling winds that knocked out the power grid across the county by 8 p.m. The duplex fell into pitch blackness. Daniel stood in his upstairs apartment, lighting a single pillar candle. The shadows danced violently across the walls as the wind battered the window panes. Downstairs, he heard the heavy wooden door of the duplex slam. Michael had already left for his 3 a.m. baking shift early, seeking refuge in the heat of his ovens. A soft knock sounded at Daniel's door. He opened it. Hannah stood in the hallway, holding a brass candlestick. The flickering flame illuminated her face, casting deep shadows under her cheekbones. She looked ethereal, tragic and entirely unhinged. She walked past him into the room without invitation. "Hannah, you shouldn't be up here," Daniel said, his voice tight. "Michael." "Michael isn't here," she interrupted, turning to face him. She dropped her candlestick onto the table. "Michael hasn't been here for weeks." She stepped into his space, her eyes burning with a raw, terrifying intensity. "No more games, Daniel. No more running away. I know what you felt at the dance. I know what you feel every time you look at me in the hallway. I am dying in this house. Touch me. Tell me you love me. Save me from this." She threw her arms around his neck, pressing her body against his with a desperate, crushing force. For a second, Daniel's control snapped. He caught her waist, burying his face in her neck, breathing in her scent. His heart hammered like a war drum. He wanted her. He wanted to throw away his badge, his brother, his morals, and drown in her. Then, the image of Michael's pale, broken face at the dance floor flashed in his mind. With an agonizing effort, Daniel grabbed her shoulders and violently shoved her away. "No," he roared, his voice echoing in the dark room. Hannah stumbled back against the table, the candle rattling. "This ends tonight, Hannah," Daniel said, his breathing ragged, his eyes cold and hard as flint. "I am your husband's brother. I will never touch you. Tomorrow, I am packing my bags and moving into an apartment downtown. You need to fix your marriage or you need to leave. But you are done using me to destroy Michael." Hannah stared at him. The rejection was complete, brutal, and absolute. The vulnerability in her face instantly hardened, curdling into a dark, venomous rage. Her humiliation was too vast to contain. "You are a coward," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You are just like him, dead inside." She grabbed her candlestick and swept out of the room, leaving Daniel alone in the dark, his hands shaking as the storm raged outside. Hannah didn't go back to her dark apartment. She put on her heavy winter coat, walked out into the freezing rain, and marched 3 blocks to the modern, gated house at the end of the street. She knocked on the door. Ethan Cole opened it, wearing a silk robe, a glass of scotch in his hand. He looked at her drenched hair, her wild eyes, and the furious determination on her face. He didn't ask questions. He smiled a slow, triumphant smile and stepped aside. "Welcome home, Hannah," he said softly. She stepped into the warmth of his house. She didn't do it for love. She didn't even do it for desire. She did it for revenge. She wanted to burn the Mercer name to the ground, to punish Daniel for his rejection and Michael for his pathetic silence. Vivian Hart watched from her dark living room window as Hannah entered Ethan's house. Vivian settled back into her armchair, sipping her tea in the dark, deeply satisfied. The pieces were moving exactly as she had designed. 2 hours later, at 3 a.m., Michael Mercer was in his detached baking kitchen. The power was out, but the massive gas-fired commercial ovens threw a dull, orange glow across the room. The air was hot and thick with the scent of rising dough. Michael stood at the wooden prep table, his hands deeply embedded in a massive lump of rye dough. But he wasn't baking. His hands were shaking violently. On the flour, dusted table beside him lay Hannah's smartphone. She had forgotten it on the kitchen counter downstairs in her rush to leave. 10 minutes ago, the screen had lit up with a preview of a text message from an unsaved number. "The door is unlocked. Come upstairs, Ethan." Michael didn't cry. He didn't scream. Something inside him, the fragile, innocent core that had spent a lifetime trying to please everyone, trying to keep the peace, simply snapped. It was a quiet, internal tragedy. He plunged his hands back into the dough, trying to knead his life back into shape, trying to find comfort in the only routine he knew. But his chest felt tight. A terrible, crushing weight was pressing down on his sternum. The air in the bakery felt too hot, too thick to breathe. He gasped for air, his vision blurring as the orange light of the ovens began to spin. Jian, Jian Jian. At 7 a.m., the storm had passed, leaving behind a pale, freezing dawn. Daniel walked down the stairs of the duplex, his duffel bag packed and swung over his shoulder. He was leaving. As he stepped out onto the porch, he noticed the lights in the bakery kitchen were still on, casting a dim glow through the frosted windows. He walked down the icy path to say goodbye to his brother, to face the executioner's song of his own guilt. "Mike," Daniel called out, pushing the heavy metal door open. The bakery was silent, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the cooling ovens. Michael lay on the concrete floor, face down in a pile of spilt flour. The massive bowl of rye dough had overturned beside him. His skin was grey, his eyes wide and vacant, staring at nothing. Daniel dropped his duffel bag and ran forward, dropping to his knees. He pulled his brother into his arms, pressing his fingers against Michael's neck. Nothing. No pulse. Mike, breathe. Come on, man, breathe," Daniel screamed, tears blinding his eyes as he began pounding on his brother's chest, performing desperate, futile CPR. But it was too late. Michael's body was already cold. The official coroner's report would later cite a massive, stress-induced myocardial infarction, a sudden heart attack. But Daniel knew the truth. It wasn't a natural death. It was a symbolic murder, executed by his own forbidden desires and Hannah's vengeful heart. 3 months later, a bitter February wind swept down Willow Street, kicking up flurries of dry, powdery snow. A for sale sign stood in front of the duplex. Daniel Mercer stood by the trunk of his car, tossing his final cardboard box inside. He looked older now. The hard lines around his eyes had deepened into permanent trenches of regret. He had resigned from the police department. He couldn't wear the badge in a town where every street corner reminded him of his failure. He was leaving, returning to the vast, empty spaces of the West, running away from his guilt once again. He looked up at the house. Hannah sat at the bay window of the downstairs apartment. She was dressed in a pristine, expensive black wool coat, a gift from Ethan, no doubt, but she sat entirely alone in the dark room. Her affair with Ethan had ended weeks ago, once the thrill of the chase was gone, and once the tragedy of Michael's death had cast a dark, scandalous pall over the town. Ethan had quietly moved on to a new target in Boston. He had won his prize, found it emotionally empty, and discarded it. Hannah didn't look at Daniel as he closed his trunk. She stared blankly at the snow falling on the empty driveway. There was no piano music coming from the house anymore. The piano had been sold to pay off Michael's outstanding bakery debts. She was completely, utterly visible now, and completely destroyed. Next door, the curtain of Vivian Hart's window twitched. Vivian stood in the warmth of her home, a cup of tea in her hand, watching Daniel's car pull away from the curb. She watched the taillights fade into the grey winter mist, her face a mask of placid, terrifying contentment. The drama was over. The board was clean. On Willow Street, the silence had finally learned everyone's name.
That's today's story. How did it make you feel after finishing it. Personally, I really like the character Vivian Hart, the next door neighbor. You know, seeing how easily someone can manipulate other people like that. It's kind of fascinating. But don't worry, I'm not a bad person. At least, I hope not. Anyway, to close things out, let's listen to some music. Tonight's recommendation is The Colors of Time by David Arkenstone. This beautiful ambient piece blends lush orchestration with vivid cinematic textures, creating a rich emotional landscape. It feels reflective, almost like traveling through memories, nostalgia, and the quiet passage of time. A perfect way to end the night. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.